Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the Christmas charity concert drowning. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries as intricate as winter frost patterns on window panes. I'm your host Connor, and today we're stepping into the world of Miss Jane Marple during the festive season in St Mary Mead. Before we begin our tale of Christmas charity turned deadly, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your location. Now, settle in with your favourite warm beverage as we follow Miss Marple through a case that proves even the season of goodwill can harbour dark intentions. Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Christmas Concert at Gossington Hall. The village of St Mary Mead had outdone itself for the Christmas charity concert. Gossington Hall, that grand residence that had seen its share of drama over the years, gleamed with festive decorations. Lady Bantry, the current mistress of the house, had opened her ballroom for the annual event, which raised funds for various village causes. This year promised to be particularly special, as Lady Bantry had secured the participation of Patricia Hammond, a renowned opera singer who had agreed to perform as a favour to her former school friend. Miss Jane Marple arrived promptly at 7, accompanied by her nephew Raymond, who was visiting for the holidays. The ballroom sparkled with candlelight and evergreen garlands, while the adjacent conservatory had been transformed into a winter wonderland. The conservatory's centrepiece was an indoor decorative pond, 18 inches deep, containing ornamental koi fish and water lilies. The surrounding tiles had been polished to a high shine, reflecting the twinkling lights strung overhead. "Quite magnificent, wouldn't you say, Aunt Jane?" Raymond remarked as they entered. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail. "Though one must be careful near that pond. The tiles look rather slippery." The concert programme featured various local performers, but Patricia Hammond was undoubtedly the star attraction. When she took the stage just before 8, a hush fell over the audience. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, tall and elegant in a midnight blue gown, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style. Her voice, when she began to sing, was extraordinary, filling the ballroom with rich, powerful notes that seemed to vibrate in the very walls. Miss Marple observed the singer with interest, noting how Patricia's eyes swept over the audience with an expression that suggested she was cataloguing rather than merely performing for them. There was something calculating in that gaze, something that set Miss Marple's instincts humming with curiosity. During Patricia's second number, Miss Marple noticed several audience members whose reactions seemed strained. Dorothy Mills, a music teacher from the neighbouring village of Much Benham, sat rigidly in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her programme. Thomas Reed, composer who had contributed a piece to the evening's repertoire, appeared similarly tense. Harold Price, a wealthy businessman from London who maintained a country house near St Mary Mead, kept glancing at his watch as though eager for the evening to end. The intermission arrived at 9 o'clock. Guests moved into the conservatory, where champagne and canapes were being served. Miss Marple accepted a glass of sherry and positioned herself near the doorway, where she could observe the mingling guests. Patricia Hammond was holding court near the pond, a champagne flute in her hand, surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations on her performance. Miss Marple counted 6 glasses of champagne that Patricia consumed during the 40-minute intermission, each brought to her by various attendees. Dorothy Mills, who was serving as one of the volunteer hostesses, seemed particularly attentive, fetching drinks and ensuring Patricia's glass was never empty. "You're quite the popular lady this evening," Miss Marple overheard Lady Bantry say to Patricia. "The price of talent, darling," Patricia replied with a laugh that held a sharp edge. "Everyone wants a piece of you when you're successful." At approximately 9:30, Miss Marple passed through the conservatory on her way to the powder room. She noticed the tiles surrounding the pond were quite dry, despite the earlier concerns about slipperiness. The decorative lighting cast pleasant shadows across the water, where the koi fish drifted lazily beneath the lily pads. When Miss Marple returned 10 minutes later, she found the conservatory in chaos. A scream had pierced the pleasant murmur of conversation. Patricia Hammond's body had been discovered face down in the pond, her midnight blue gown floating around her like dark petals, her carefully styled hair now sodden and dishevelled. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, but it was immediately clear there was nothing to be done. Patricia Hammond was dead, apparently drowned in less than 2 feet of water. The tiles around the pond were now wet, suggesting she had slipped and fallen, striking her head and losing consciousness before drowning in the shallow water. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after, his usual bluster somewhat muted by the festive setting and the presence of so many prominent citizens. He interviewed witnesses perfunctorily, seeming satisfied with the apparent accident narrative. Patricia had been drinking heavily, the tiles were wet and slippery, a tragic mishap during what should have been a joyous evening. But Miss Marple stood quietly near the pond, her knitting bag over her arm, observing details others overlooked. Those tiles had been dry earlier, she was certain of it. And something about Dorothy Mills's solicitous attention to Patricia's champagne consumption nagged at her memory. She had seen such careful attention before, in very different circumstances, and the memory made her frown thoughtfully. As the concert guests were ushered out and the police began their preliminary investigation, Miss Marple remained, her mild blue eyes missing nothing, her instincts telling her that this Christmas charity concert had just become the stage for something far darker than a simple accident. Chapter 2. The Opera Singer's Secret Life. The morning after the tragedy at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead awoke to a coating of fresh snow and whispered conversations in every shop and parlour. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles working steadily as she considered the events of the previous evening. The official verdict appeared to be accidental death, but something troubled her about the entire affair. Inspector Slack called on her late that morning, looking harried and slightly defensive. Despite his usual dismissiveness of what he called amateur interference, he had learned over the years that Miss Marple's observations often proved valuable. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know about the post-mortem," he said, accepting a cup of tea. Dr. Haydock found massive amounts of sedatives in her system, benzodiazepines he called them, enough to knock out a horse. Miss Marple's needles paused. Not champagne alone, then? Definitely not. Someone drugged her, waited for her to become incapacitated, then positioned her face down in that pond. Inspector Slack set down his cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. This wasn't an accident. It was murder disguised to look like one. "I had wondered," Miss Marple said quietly. "The tiles around the pond were dry when I passed through 30 minutes before the body was discovered. Someone wetted them afterward to support the accidental slip narrative." The inspector made a note of this. "That's useful. Problem is, nearly 40 people had access to the conservatory during intermission. Patricia Hammond drank at least 6 glasses of champagne, served by different people from bottles available to all guests. Could have been any glass, any moment. But surely the sedatives would alter the taste of the champagne," Miss Marple suggested. "Dr. Haydock says benzodiazepines are relatively tasteless, especially in a sweet sparkling wine." Miss Hammond was drinking enthusiastically. She likely wouldn't have noticed anything amiss. Over the following days, as Inspector Slack conducted his official investigation, Miss Marple pursued her own inquiries through the efficient grapevine of village gossip. What emerged was a portrait quite different from the celebrated opera singer who had graced Gossington Hall's stage. Patricia Hammond, it transpired, had built a second career alongside her musical one. She collected secrets about patrons, conductors, and fellow performers, then extracted money or favours in exchange for her silence. Her victims were numerous, but 5 had been present at the Christmas concert. Dorothy Mill's story came first, whispered by Mrs. Price at the butcher's shop. 10 years ago, Dorothy had been an accompanist for a prestigious London orchestra. She had engaged in an affair with the married conductor, a relationship Patricia had documented through photographs and letters. When Dorothy refused to pay for Patricia's silence, the evidence had been delivered to the conductor's wife and the orchestra's board. Dorothy lost her position and retreated to teaching music in Much Benham, her promising career destroyed. Thomas Reed's troubles were more recent. The composer had achieved success with a piece premiered 2 years ago, but Patricia possessed proof that significant portions had been plagiarized from an obscure Eastern European composer. She had been extracting quarterly payments from Reed to prevent exposure that would ruin his reputation permanently. Harold Price's involvement was financial. During an investigation of her own tax affairs, Patricia had discovered irregularities in Price's property development company. The evidence suggested systematic fraud. Patricia had demanded substantial payments, which Price had paid reluctantly, knowing exposure would mean prison. Sarah Fletcher, a young violinist who had performed earlier in the concert, carried the burden of her father's sins. He had embezzled from the opera company where both he and Patricia had worked. Patricia held documents proving the theft, and Sarah had been paying blackmail for 3 years to protect her father's memory and prevent her mother from learning the truth. Finally, there was Marcus Webb, a tenor who had sung a duet with Patricia during the concert. His closeted sexuality, carefully guarded in the conservative opera world, had been discovered by Patricia through indiscreet letters. She had used this knowledge to control his career choices, forcing him to turn down roles that would have advanced his standing in favour of opportunities that benefited her own career. Each of these 5 individuals had strong motive for murder. Each had been paying Patricia thousands of pounds over the years, and each had been pushed to a breaking point when 3 months earlier, Patricia had announced her intention to write a memoir revealing all the scandals she had collected during her career. She said it would be a celebration of truth in the arts, Sarah Fletcher told Miss Marple during a carefully orchestrated tea at the vicarage, but it was really just one final twist of the knife. After taking our money for years, she planned to expose everything anyway. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. That must have been very distressing for everyone concerned. Distressing doesn't begin to describe it. Sarah's hands trembled. For some of us, those revelations would destroy everything we've built since the original scandals. The investigation into the sedatives proved equally illuminating. Dr. Haydock identified the specific benzodiazepine as one available only by prescription. Inspector Slack obtained pharmacy records, discovering that 3 concert attendees had current prescriptions for the drug. Dorothy Mills took the medication for anxiety, a condition that had worsened since her career's destruction. Harold Price used it for insomnia, and Patricia Hammond herself had been prescribed it for performance anxiety, though she rarely took it, preferring champagne as her relaxant of choice. Any of them could have provided the drug, Inspector Slack admitted to Miss Marple. Mills and Price both claim their prescriptions are at home, accounted for. We can't prove otherwise, and Patricia's own bottle was in her hotel room, apparently untouched. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The killer had been clever, using a drug that couldn't be traced definitively to them alone, but cleverness, in her experience, often contained the seeds of mistakes. One simply had to look carefully enough to find them. Chapter 3. The Decorative Pond's Dark Purpose. 2 days after Patricia Hammond's death, Miss Marple requested permission from Lady Bantry to examine the conservatory more closely. Lady Bantry, still shaken by the tragedy that had occurred in her home, agreed readily. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm Patricia," Lady Bantry said as she unlocked the conservatory door. "Yes, she could be difficult, but murder seems so extreme." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound as she entered the conservatory. The festive decorations remained in place, though they now seemed incongruous given the recent death. The pond sat at the room's centre, its water still and clear, the koi fish gliding beneath the surface as though nothing untoward had occurred. She examined the tiles surrounding the pond with great care, noting their composition and the slight slope designed to drain any overflow back into the pond itself. The tiles were dry now, as they had been before Patricia's death. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, running her fingers along the surface. "These tiles have excellent drainage," she observed. "Any water spilled on them would run back into the pond within minutes. For them to have been wet when Patricia's body was discovered, someone would have had to splash water on them very shortly before the discovery." She stood, contemplating the pond's design. The automated system maintaining the water level was visible, a small pump and filter arrangement tucked discreetly behind decorative rocks. The water level held steady at precisely 18 inches, as indicated by a marker on the pond's interior wall. "Deep enough to drown someone who was unconscious and face down," Miss Marple murmured, "but shallow enough that a conscious person could simply stand up. Quite deliberate in its design, really, though the original architect surely never imagined such a use." Raymond, who had accompanied his aunt, looked troubled. "You're certain this was murder, then?" "I'm certain the scene was staged to appear accidental, which amounts to the same thing." Miss Marple moved around the pond, examining sightlines and potential hiding places. "The killer needed Patricia unconscious before placing her in the water. The sedatives accomplished that, but timing would have been crucial. Too early, and Patricia might have collapsed in the ballroom. Too late, and someone might have noticed her distress before she could be guided here. She paused at the spot where Patricia's champagne glass had been found. Inspector Slack had taken it as evidence, but the location told its own story. It sat on a small decorative table near the pond's edge, positioned as though Patricia had set it down before her fatal fall. The glass contained sediment, Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Raymond. That indicates the sedatives were added to this specific glass, rather than to a champagne bottle. Someone approached Patricia directly with drugged champagne. But dozens of people were serving champagne during intermission, Raymond objected. How can you determine who gave her that particular glass? Miss Marple smiled slightly. By considering who had both motive and opportunity, and by observing behaviour that seems helpful but serves a darker purpose. Human nature is remarkably consistent, Raymond. I've seen similar patterns many times before. Over the next several days, Miss Marple conducted quiet conversations with various concert attendees, asking about their interactions with Patricia during the evening. Most remembered little, distracted by the festivities and their own conversations. But a pattern gradually emerged. Dorothy Mills had been particularly attentive to Patricia Hammond throughout the intermission. Multiple guests mentioned seeing Dorothy refreshing Patricia's champagne, offering canapes, and ensuring the opera singer had everything she needed. Such behaviour seemed natural for a volunteer hostess, yet it also provided perfect cover for more sinister actions. Dorothy was so thoughtful, Mrs. Clement from the vicarage recalled. I remember her telling Patricia that her champagne had gone flat, offering to fetch a fresh glass. Patricia was quite grateful. She'd been complaining that the champagne wasn't properly chilled. Miss Marple filed this information carefully. A flat glass of champagne would be replaced without suspicion. Anyone might refuse a drink from a stranger, but accepting a fresh glass from an attentive hostess seemed perfectly natural. She paid a call on Dr. Haydock, finding him in his study reviewing medical journals. He looked up with interest as Miss Marple explained her observations about the conservatory. The tiles were definitely dry earlier in the evening, he asked. Quite dry. I specifically noticed because I had been concerned about slipping hazards. The tiles were polished but not wet. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. That supports the murder theory. The wetness was staging, added after Patricia was already in the water. Classic misdirection. What can you tell me about the sedatives in her system? Enough to render her unconscious within 10 to 15 minutes of consumption. She would have felt increasingly drowsy, perhaps dizzy before losing consciousness entirely. In her state, she wouldn't have been able to resist being guided to the conservatory. And once there, positioning her in the pond would have been straightforward, Miss Marple concluded. Face down in 18 inches of water, unconscious from the drugs. Death would have occurred within minutes. Precisely. The actual cause of death was drowning, but she was murdered, just as surely as if she'd been shot. Miss Marple thanked the doctor and made her way home through the snowy village. The case was taking shape in her mind, the pattern emerging like a design in her knitting. But she needed one more piece of evidence, one more thread to tie everything together. The sedatives were the key, not their type or their effect, but their source and their presence at the concert. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reviewing everything she knew. 5 people with motive, 3 people with legitimate access to the sedatives, 1 person whose behaviour during the intermission had been both helpful and suspicious. The pattern was there, clear as crystal once you knew where to look. Tomorrow, she would need to speak with Inspector Slack. The truth was ready to emerge, but it would require careful handling. Murder at Christmas, disguised as holiday mishap, corrupting an event meant to celebrate charity and goodwill. It was, Miss Marple reflected sadly, a particularly cruel crime, made worse by its festive setting and charitable purpose. Chapter 4. Prescription for Murder. The following morning brought another snowfall to St. Mary Mead, transforming the village into a Christmas card scene that belied the darkness of recent events. Miss Marple received a telephone call from Inspector Slack requesting her presence at the police station. He sounded unusually respectful, a tone he adopted only when his investigation had stalled. I've been following up on those sedative prescriptions, he said, when Miss Marple arrived, settling into a chair across from his cluttered desk. Dorothy Mills, Harold Price, and Patricia Hammond herself all had legitimate access to benzodiazepines. Mills says her prescription bottle is at home with all pills accounted for. Price says the same. Patricia's bottle was found in her hotel room, apparently untouched. Apparently, Miss Marple echoed softly. What do you mean by that? I mean that appearances can be deceiving, Inspector. Someone who plans murder carefully would naturally ensure that evidence pointing to them was either destroyed or explained away. She paused, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm. Have you examined the contents of Patricia's prescription bottle? Inspector Slack frowned. The bottle itself, yes. It contained the expected pills. But did you count them? A long pause followed. I'll look into that. While the inspector made telephone calls to verify the pill count, Miss Marple sat quietly, working on a scarf she was knitting for the church bazaar. The pattern was intricate, requiring careful attention to each stitch. Rather like this case, she reflected. One wrong assumption, and the entire pattern would fail. Inspector Slack returned, looking thoughtful. The prescription was for 30 pills dated 6 weeks ago. The bottle contains 30 pills. How convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And Dorothy Mill's prescription. Issued 8 weeks ago. 30 pills. She claims perhaps a dozen remain, though she hasn't counted exactly. And Harold Price's? Similar story. Issued 3 months ago, claims to have perhaps 10 left. Miss Marple's needles paused. Inspector, has anyone examined the pills in Patricia's bottle to confirm they are indeed the prescribed medication? Inspector Slack stared at her. You think someone substituted different pills? I think a murderer who had access to sedatives might have replaced their own diminished supply with innocuous tablets, then claimed their prescription was intact. Meanwhile, Patricia's bottle, conveniently found in her hotel room, could have been altered to show a full count, deflecting suspicion. Within hours, the police laboratory had analysed the contents of Patricia Hammond's prescription bottle. The results confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The bottle contained 30 tablets of aspirin rather than benzodiazepines. Someone had carefully replaced the sedatives with look-alike pills, creating the appearance of an untouched prescription while actually having used those sedatives for murder. This is excellent work, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack admitted grudgingly. But it doesn't tell us which of our suspects did the switching. Mills and Price both could have had access to Patricia's hotel room. They were all staying at the same inn. Miss Marple nodded. But consider the logistics, Inspector. To switch the pills, one would need access to Patricia's room at a time when she was definitely absent. The concert rehearsal, perhaps. There was a full rehearsal the afternoon before the concert. All the performers attended. That would have given someone 3 hours with the rooms empty. And who among our suspects attended that rehearsal? Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Dorothy Mills was there. She accompanied several of the musical numbers on piano. There's something else you should know, Miss Marple said quietly. I've been making inquiries about Dorothy Mills' current prescription. She obtained it 8 weeks ago, as you said, for 30 pills. The recommended dosage for anxiety is 1 pill as needed, usually no more than 3 per week. Even if she'd taken the maximum dosage, she should have more than a dozen pills remaining. But she admits to having approximately a dozen. Exactly. Which means either she's been taking more than prescribed, or she's used some for another purpose. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. I believe if you were to examine her prescription bottle carefully, you would find the count doesn't quite match her estimate. Inspector Slack made another call, this time requesting officers to visit Dorothy Mills and verify her medication count. Miss Marple waited patiently, working on her scarf. She knew what they would find. The pattern was complete now, all the pieces fitting together with unfortunate clarity. When the call came back, Inspector Slack's expression was grim. Dorothy Mills' bottle contains only 5 pills. Based on prescription date and recommended dosage, there should be at least 20. She claims she must have miscounted, that she's been taking them more frequently due to stress. Or, Miss Marple said gently, she crushed approximately 20 pills into powder, mixed them with Patricia Hammond's champagne, and is now caught between admitting to taking excessive medication or admitting to murder. We need more than a missing pill count to charge her. Then perhaps we should examine what happened during the intermission more carefully. Several people mentioned Dorothy offering Patricia a fresh glass of champagne, claiming her current glass had gone flat. That would have been the perfect opportunity to deliver drugged champagne without arousing suspicion. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his coat. I think it's time we had another conversation with Miss Mills. Miss Marple stood as well. "If I might accompany you, Inspector, I believe Dorothy is more likely to confess to a sympathetic older woman than to a police officer. And this is, after all, a case of desperation rather than calculated malice. Patricia Hammond's blackmail had already destroyed Dorothy's career once. The threat of her memoir would have made that destruction permanent and public." "You have a point." Inspector Slack held the door for her. "Though I warn you, if she confesses, you'll need to give testimony." "I understand," Miss Marple said quietly. "Murder is murder, regardless of provocation. But understanding the why helps in comprehending the how, and in this case the why is quite heartbreaking. A talented woman destroyed by scandal, paying blackmail for years, then facing renewed exposure. It doesn't excuse murder, but it does explain it." As they drove through the snowy landscape toward Dorothy Mill's cottage in Much Benham, Miss Marple reflected on how Christmas, meant to be a season of forgiveness and charity, had instead become the setting for desperate measures. The charity concert, with its festive decorations and celebration of artistic talent, had provided the perfect cover for murder, and the conservatory pond, designed to bring beauty and tranquility, had become an instrument of death. Human nature, she thought sadly, remained constant regardless of season. Under sufficient pressure, even good people could commit terrible acts. The challenge was ensuring that justice served the truth while acknowledging the complex circumstances that led to tragedy. Chapter 5. The Hostess with the Poisoned Glass. Dorothy Mills's cottage sat at the edge of Much Benham, a tidy structure with a snow-covered garden and smoke curling from the chimney. As Inspector Slack's car pulled up outside, Miss Marple observed curtains twitch in the front window. Dorothy had seen them arrive. She answered the door before they could knock, her face pale but composed. She was a woman in her late 40s, with greying hair pulled back severely and eyes that held a deep weariness. Without a word, she stepped aside to let them enter. "I suppose you've come about the pills," she said quietly, leading them to a small sitting room dominated by an upright piano covered with sheet music. "I knew someone would notice eventually." Inspector Slack began the formal caution, but Dorothy waved it away. "Please, Inspector, I know my rights, but I also know when the game is over." She turned to Miss Marple. "You figured it out, didn't you? At the concert, or perhaps afterward?" "The tiles around the pond troubled me," Miss Marple replied gently, taking a seat on the worn sofa. "They were dry when I passed through earlier, yet wet when Patricia's body was discovered. Someone had staged the scene to suggest an accidental fall." Dorothy nodded slowly, sinking into an armchair. "I thought of everything except that. The perfect crime, ruined by dry tiles." A bitter smile touched her lips. "How appropriate. My life was ruined by small details too. A photograph here, a letter there. Patricia was always so good at noticing details." "Why don't you tell us what happened?" Inspector Slack suggested, his notebook ready. "In your own words." Dorothy was silent for a long moment, staring at her piano. When she spoke, her voice was distant as though recounting someone else's story. 10 years ago, I was the accompanist for the London Symphony Orchestra. It was my dream position, everything I'd worked for. Then I made a mistake. I fell in love with the conductor, Richard Ashford. He was married, unhappily he said, and I believed him. We were careful, or so I thought. She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. Patricia Hammond was performing with the orchestra that season. She noticed things others missed. The glances between Richard and me, the way we found excuses to be alone during rehearsals. She started documenting our affair. Photographs, copies of notes we'd exchanged, even recordings of our conversations. "She blackmailed you," Miss Marple said softly. "She offered me a choice. Pay her £10,000 or she would deliver the evidence to Richard's wife and the orchestra board. I refused. I thought she was bluffing." Dorothy's voice cracked slightly. She wasn't. Within a week, everything came out. Richard's wife divorced him. I was dismissed from the orchestra. My reputation was destroyed. I ended up here, teaching piano to children, all my ambitions reduced to scales and simple melodies. "But you continued paying her," Inspector Slack prompted. "Eventually. She approached me 2 years later, offering to keep the story from spreading further for £5,000 annually. By then, I was desperate enough to agree. I've paid her every year since." Dorothy's hands clenched. £25,000 total for a mistake I made a decade ago. "And then she announced her memoir," Miss Marple said. Yes. Dorothy's voice hardened. 3 months ago, Patricia sent a letter to all her victims. She was writing a tell-all book about secrets in the classical music world. Our stories would be in it, every sordid detail. After taking our money for years, she planned to expose us anyway. The blackmail had been just the beginning. The book would be her final triumph and our final humiliation. She stood abruptly, moving to the window. For me, it meant the end of any chance at rebuilding my career. Music schools won't hire teachers involved in public scandals. My students' parents would withdraw them. Everything I've built here would collapse. I couldn't let that happen. So, you planned to kill her at the charity concert, Inspector Slack said. Dorothy turned back, her expression strangely calm. I volunteered to be a hostess specifically for that purpose. It gave me legitimate reason to circulate with drinks, to approach Patricia without suspicion. I'd already replaced the pills in her prescription bottle at the hotel with aspirin during the rehearsal. I thought that would deflect suspicion from my own prescription. How did you administer the sedatives? Miss Marple asked. I crushed 20 pills into fine powder at home. During the intermission, I had the powder in a small decorative pillbox in my pocket. When Patricia complained that her champagne had gone flat, I offered to fetch her a fresh glass. I went to the service table, took a glass of champagne, added the powder, stirred it thoroughly, and brought it back to her. She never suspected. She thought I was being helpful. Dorothy's voice remained eerily steady, as though recounting a cooking recipe rather than murder. The sedatives dissolved completely in the champagne. The sweet sparkling wine masked any slight taste alteration. Patricia drank it gratefully, praising my attentiveness. I waited nearby, watching for signs the drugs were taking effect. How long did it take? Inspector Slack asked. About 15 minutes. She began to seem drowsy, slightly disoriented. She mentioned feeling strange, said perhaps she'd had too much champagne. I suggested she might want some fresh air, offered to accompany her to the conservatory. She agreed readily. By the time we reached the conservatory, she could barely walk. I had to support her weight. Miss Marple said nothing, her knitting needles still, her eyes sad but attentive. The conservatory was empty, Dorothy continued. Everyone was in the ballroom, finishing their drinks before the second half began. I guided Patricia to the pond, told her to splash some water on her face to revive. Herself. She tried to bend down, lost her balance. I helped her fall forward, held her head under the water until she stopped struggling. It took less than a minute. And then you staged the accident, Inspector Slack said. Yes. I positioned her face down, arranged her dress to look natural. Then I splashed water on the tiles around the pond to suggest she'd slipped. I took her champagne glass, the one with the sedatives, and placed a clean glass near the pond instead. The drugged glass I rinsed thoroughly and left with the other used glasses on the service table. No one would ever know which glass had been hers. Dorothy returned to her chair, suddenly seeming exhausted. I returned to the ballroom, established my presence there. 10 minutes later, someone discovered the body. I acted appropriately shocked, appropriately grieved, but inside I felt nothing, just relief that it was done, that Patricia could never hurt anyone again. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. Dorothy Mills, I'm arresting you for the murder of Patricia Hammond. You've already been cautioned. Do you understand? I understand. Dorothy looked at Miss Marple. What gave me away? The tiles? Partly, Miss Marple replied gently, but also your excessive attentiveness to Patricia during the intermission. It seemed like hospitality, but it was actually surveillance. You were monitoring her condition, waiting for the drugs to take effect, and the missing pills from your prescription. Once we knew the pills in Patricia's bottle had been switched, the discrepancy in your count became telling. I should have thought of that. Dorothy stood, accepting the handcuffs Inspector Slack held out. I planned so carefully, yet I missed obvious details. Rather ironic, given that Patricia's attention to detail is what destroyed me in the first place. As they prepared to leave, Dorothy turned back once more. Miss Marple, do you think I'm evil for what I did? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. I think you were desperate, and desperation can drive good people to terrible acts. What Patricia Hammond did to you and others was cruel, but taking her life was not justice. It was revenge, and revenge always exacts its own price. Yes, Dorothy said softly. I see that now. The drive back to St. Mary Mead was silent. Inspector Slack concentrating on the snowy roads while Miss Marple gazed out at the winter landscape. She thought about Dorothy Mills, whose promising career had been destroyed by a single mistake and years of blackmail. She thought about Patricia Hammond, whose talent had been corrupted by greed and vindictiveness. And she thought about how the Christmas charity concert, meant to celebrate art and raise funds for good causes, had become the stage for a desperate woman's final act. As they entered St. Mary Mead, church bells began ringing for evening service, their clear notes carrying across the snowy village. It was still Christmas season, though the joy seemed muted now by knowledge of what had transpired at Gossington Hall. "Will you testify at trial?" Inspector Slack asked as he dropped Miss Marple at her cottage. "If required," she replied, "though I suspect Dorothy will plead guilty. She's confessed fully, and she seems almost relieved that the truth has emerged. Living with murder is its own punishment, Inspector. The trial will merely formalize what she already knows." Inspector Slack nodded. "Thank you for your help, Miss Marple. We couldn't have solved this without your observations." After he left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, resuming her knitting. The case was concluded, justice would be served, but satisfaction eluded her. 2 lives destroyed by secrets and blackmail, a Christmas celebration corrupted by murder, and a community's faith in seasonal goodwill shaken by proof that darkness could intrude even in festive moments. Her needles clicked steadily as darkness fell outside, each stitch a small attempt to restore order to a world that seemed increasingly tangled and complex. Chapter 6. The Blackmail Network Exposed. The days following Dorothy Mills' arrest brought unexpected revelations to St. Mary Mead. As Inspector Slack's investigation expanded beyond the murder itself, the full scope of Patricia Hammond's blackmail operation came to light. It was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Marple received a visit from Sarah Fletcher 3 days after Dorothy's confession. The young violinist appeared at her door looking anxious but determined, clutching a folder of papers against her chest. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with someone," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Inspector Slack has been questioning all of us who were victims of Patricia's blackmail. I think you should know the truth about what she did to us, about how desperate we all were." Miss Marple invited her in, settling the young woman in her comfortable parlour with tea and biscuits. Sarah sat stiffly, the folder still pressed against her chest like a shield. "You knew about the blackmail before Dorothy's confession," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "I had pieced together certain facts," Miss Marple admitted. "Village gossip is remarkably informative if one knows how to interpret it properly." Sarah nodded slowly, then opened the folder, spreading papers across the tea table. Letters, bank statements, and photographs formed a damning collection of evidence against Patricia Hammond's character. "This is everything Patricia had on my father," Sarah explained. "Inspector Slack returned it to me after they searched Patricia's hotel room. My father embezzled £70,000 from the opera company where he worked. He died before the theft was discovered, and I thought his secret had died with him. Then Patricia contacted me 3 years ago." Miss Marple examined the documents carefully. They showed a systematic pattern of theft spanning 18 months, cleverly disguised within routine accounting. Entries. Only someone with Patricia's access to company records would have noticed the discrepancies. "She gave me a choice," Sarah continued. "Pay £15,000 immediately, then £5,000 annually, or she would expose my father's theft to the authorities and to my mother. My mother never knew what he'd done. Learning the truth would destroy her memory of him, destroy her completely. I've been working 3 jobs to afford the payments." "And then she announced her memoir," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes, 3 months ago. After bleeding me dry for years, she planned to publish everything anyway. My father's theft, my payments, all of it. She said it would make compelling reading, a daughter sacrificing everything to protect her father's reputation." Sarah's voice broke. She was going to turn my love for my parents into entertainment, into a cautionary tale for her readers. Over the following days, the other victims came forward, each bringing their own folders of evidence, their own stories of years spent under Patricia's control. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had turned blackmail into an art form, using her position in the opera world to gather information, then exploiting that information for profit and power. Thomas Reed arrived next, the composer whose plagiarism Patricia had documented. He was a thin, nervous man in his 60s, whose hands shook as he handled the papers he brought. I was young and desperate, he explained to Miss Marple and Inspector Slack, who had joined them to take official statements. A competition offered a substantial prize for Best New Composition. I found this piece by a Hungarian composer who had died in obscurity. I convinced myself that I was giving his work the recognition it deserved, that it wasn't really theft if the original composer was unknown. Patricia discovered the truth, Miss Marple prompted. She had contacts throughout Europe, colleagues who recognized the themes when my piece was performed. She confronted me with the original score, with proof of the composition date, with everything I tried to hide. She demanded £20,000 initially, then quarterly payments of £2,000 for 2 years. I've been paying her, watching my career advance on stolen work, while giving her a portion of everything I earned. The admission of plagiarism would end his career, Reed explained, would invalidate every award and commission he'd received. When Patricia announced her memoir, he'd seriously considered suicide. Only his wife's support had kept him from that final act of desperation. Harold Price's story involved corporate fraud on a larger scale. His property development company had systematically avoided taxes through complex offshore arrangements. Patricia had discovered the scheme while investigating her own financial affairs, finding connections between her investments and Price's companies. She demanded £100,000, Price told them, his successful businessman's facade cracking, then £50,000 annually. I've paid her £350,000 over 7 years. The company could afford it, but the constant drain, the knowledge that she owned me, it was unbearable. When she threatened to include it in her memoir, I knew exposure would mean criminal prosecution, prison time, the complete destruction of everything I'd built. Marcus Webb's situation was perhaps the most painful. The tenor's closeted sexuality had been used by Patricia not just for money, but for career manipulation. She had forced him to turn down roles that would have established him as a leading performer, instead compelling him to accept smaller parts in productions where Patricia herself was the star. She kept me small, Marcus explained, his voice tight with years of suppressed anger. Every time I was offered something significant, she would threaten to expose me. In the opera world, being openly gay still carries stigma, limits opportunities. I could have come out on my own terms, built a career regardless. But she turned it into a weapon, used it to control every aspect of my professional life. I've paid her perhaps £50,000 over the years, but the real cost was my career, my potential, everything I could have been. As these stories emerged, Inspector Slack's investigation expanded to examine Patricia Hammond's financial records. They discovered she had accumulated substantial wealth from her blackmail operation, far more than her opera career could have provided. Bank accounts in 3 countries held over £2 million, all gained through extracting money from victims whose secrets she'd uncovered. She was systematic, Inspector Slack told Miss Marple during one of their discussions. She kept meticulous records like a business ledger. Each victim had a file with documentation, payment schedules, notes on their vulnerabilities. She even rated them on how likely they were to pay versus how likely to go to authorities. "And the memoir?" Miss Marple asked. "We found the manuscript in her hotel room. 300 pages of exposés, naming names, providing details. If published, it would have destroyed dozens of careers, ruined countless lives. She'd already secured a publishing contract with a major house, eager for the scandal and sales such a book would generate. The manuscript made for disturbing reading. Patricia had written with clinical detachment about the people she'd blackmailed, describing their weaknesses and their desperation with cold amusement. There was no empathy, no recognition that she was destroying lives. Only satisfaction in her power over others and anticipation of the attention her revelations would bring. Miss Marple read portions of the manuscript that Inspector Slack shared with her, her expression growing increasingly sad. She corrupted everything she touched, Miss Marple observed. Her musical talent, her position in the opera world even. The charity concert became tools for her manipulation. She invited her victims to attend specifically to demonstrate her power over them, to make them perform alongside her, while knowing she could destroy them at any moment. Several of them have admitted they considered killing her, Inspector Slack said. Thomas Reed brought a knife to the concert, hidden in his jacket. Harold Price had researched poisons. Marcus Webb had written detailed plans for staging an accident. They all wanted her dead, but only Dorothy Mills actually did it. Because Dorothy had the means and the opportunity, Miss Marple replied. The sedatives, her role as hostess, her knowledge of the conservatory layout. The others wanted Patricia dead but lacked the specific circumstances to accomplish it. Dorothy had everything align at once. The discovery of Patricia's blackmail network raised complicated questions about the prosecution. Several lawyers argued that Dorothy Mills had, in a sense, been acting to protect not just herself but all of Patricia's victims. The memoir would have destroyed multiple lives, and Patricia's death had prevented that destruction. Public opinion, once the full story emerged, was divided. Some viewed Dorothy as a murderer who deserved the full penalty of law. Others saw her as a victim driven to desperate measures by years of abuse and the threat of renewed destruction. The charity concert, meant to raise funds for village causes, had instead raised troubling questions about justice, revenge, and the limits of sympathy for those who kill their tormentors. Miss Marple found herself troubled by the moral complexity of the case. Dorothy had committed murder, clearly and deliberately. Yet Patricia Hammond's systematic destruction of lives through blackmail was itself a form of violence, one that society permitted because it operated within legal boundaries. The law recognized theft of money, but not theft of dignity, prosecuted physical violence, but not the emotional violence of extortion and threat. It's a tangle, she admitted to her nephew Raymond one evening as they sat by her fire. Dorothy deserves punishment for taking a life, but Patricia deserved something as well for the lives she destroyed. The legal system will address one crime, but not the other. Perhaps that's why vigilante justice is so appealing, Raymond suggested. When the system fails to address certain wrongs, people take matters into their own hands. But that way lies chaos, Miss Marple replied firmly. Once we decide that murder is acceptable when the victim is sufficiently odious, we've lost the foundation of civilized society. Dorothy should have gone to the authorities, exposed Patricia's blackmail operation, accepted the personal cost of that exposure. Instead, she chose murder, and that choice cannot be excused, however understandable the desperation that drove it. As Christmas approached its conclusion, St. Mary Mead found itself grappling with uncomfortable truths about human nature, justice, and the prices people pay for secrets. The charity concert, meant to celebrate seasonal goodwill, had instead revealed the darkness that could lurk beneath festive appearances, proving once again that evil could flourish anywhere, even in the most innocent settings, when desperation and opportunity aligned. Chapter 7. The Conservatory's Silent Witness. A week after Dorothy Mills's arrest, Miss Marple returned to Gossington Hall at Lady Bantry's invitation. The conservatory had remained closed since Patricia Hammond's death, but Lady Bantry wished to reopen it and wanted Miss Marple's opinion on whether any changes to the space might prevent future tragedies. Though I can't imagine we'll host another charity concert anytime soon, Lady Bantry admitted as she unlocked the conservatory door. The entire affair has cast such a shadow over the hall. I've had 3 event cancellations already, people nervous about the space's associations with murder. Miss Marple stepped into the conservatory, noting how different it appeared in daylight without the festive decorations. The pond sat peacefully at the room's centre, its koi fish gliding through clear water, the lily pads floating serenely on the surface. Nothing in the scene suggested the violence that had occurred here. The pond itself is blameless, Miss Marple observed. It's simply water and fish and plants designed to bring beauty to your home. The evil was in human hearts, not in this space. As they stood contemplating the pond, they were joined by Dr. Haydock, who had also been invited to offer his professional opinion on safety measures. He examined the tiles surrounding the pond with a critical eye. The drainage system is excellent, he noted. Water doesn't pool on these tiles under normal circumstances. That should have been our first clue that the scene was staged. Anyone slipping would have landed on dry tiles, not wet ones. Miss Marple nodded. The killer's attempt to create a believable accident scene actually undermined the deception. Too much attention to detail can be as revealing as too little. They were interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb, the tenor who had been one of Patricia's blackmail victims. He stood at the conservatory entrance looking uncertain, his hat turning nervously in his hands. "I apologise for intruding," he said. "I saw your cars and wondered if I might have a word, Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, about the concert." Lady Bantry invited him in. offering tea from a service that had been set up in the conservatory's seating area. Marcus accepted gratefully, though his hands shook slightly as he held the cup. "I've been thinking about that evening," Marcus began, "about what I saw and didn't see, what I noticed but didn't understand the significance of at the time. Inspector Slack has questioned me repeatedly, but I don't think I've been entirely helpful. My own guilt and fear clouded my observations." "What did you notice?" Miss Marple asked gently. Marcus set down his teacup. "Dorothy Mills. During the intermission, I watched her with Patricia, not because I suspected anything, but because I was jealous of how attentive she was being. You see, I had planned to approach Patricia myself that evening, to beg her one final time not to publish her memoir, but Dorothy was always there, hovering, ensuring Patricia's glass was full, monopolizing her attention." "You said you watched them," Miss Marple prompted. "What specifically did you observe?" "Dorothy fetched Patricia a fresh glass of champagne about 20 minutes into the intermission. She made a point of saying Patricia's current glass had gone flat. At the time, I thought she was being helpful, even admirably thoughtful. Now, knowing what we know, I realize I watched her deliver the poisoned drink." He paused, his expression pained. "I could have prevented it. If I'd approached Patricia instead of hanging back, if I'd insisted on speaking with her right then, Dorothy wouldn't have had her opportunity. Patricia would still be alive, and Dorothy wouldn't be facing murder charges." "You couldn't have known," Lady Bantry said kindly. "But I saw," Marcus insisted. "I watched Dorothy's face when she handed Patricia that glass. There was something in her expression, an intensity that seemed odd for such a simple gesture. I dismissed it as my imagination, as stress from my own situation. But I think, deep down, I recognized that something was wrong. I just didn't want to see it." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Did you notice when Patricia began to show signs of the sedatives taking effect?" "Yes, about 15 minutes after she drank from that glass. She became quieter, less animated. She kept pressing her hand to her forehead as though she had a headache. Thomas Reed tried to engage her in conversation about the second half program, but she seemed unable to focus. She said she felt strange, asked if perhaps the champagne was stronger than usual." "And Dorothy's reaction?" "Attentive, immediately concerned. She suggested fresh air, offered to accompany Patricia to the conservatory. Patricia agreed readily. She seemed grateful for Dorothy's consideration." Marcus's voice dropped. "I watched them leave the ballroom together. Patricia was leaning on Dorothy's arm, moving slowly. I thought she was simply tired, or perhaps had drunk too much. It never occurred to me that she was dying, that Dorothy was leading her to her death." Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "Did you see anyone else notice them leaving?" "Several people must have, but no one seemed alarmed. Dorothy was a hostess, Patricia was a guest feeling unwell. It appeared perfectly innocent. That's the horrible brilliance of it. Dorothy created a situation where murdering someone looked like helping them." They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating how Dorothy had exploited social conventions and expectations to accomplish murder. The role of helpful hostess had provided perfect cover for delivering poison and then escorting the victim to the killing site. Marcus eventually continued. "I waited perhaps 10 minutes, then went to the conservatory myself. I was still hoping to speak with Patricia privately, away from the crowd. When I arrived, the conservatory appeared empty. I walked around the pond, looked in the adjacent sitting areas. I didn't see Patricia or Dorothy anywhere." "But they must have been here," Miss Marple said. "They were. They must have been in one of the recessed alcoves hidden by the palm fronds Lady Bantry has arranged throughout the conservatory. I heard voices, low and urgent. I thought perhaps Patricia was being sick, that Dorothy was helping her. I felt it would be intrusive to interrupt, so I left, returned to the ballroom. That was perhaps 5 minutes before the body was discovered." This was new information, and Miss Marple absorbed it carefully. "You heard voices. Could you distinguish what was being said?" Marcus shook his head. "Just murmurs, but the tone was strange. Dorothy sounded almost soothing, the way you might speak to calm a frightened child. Patricia's voice was slurred, confused, and then there was silence." "Silence," Dr. Haydock repeated. "That would have been when Dorothy positioned Patricia in the pond." "Yes," Marcus said miserably. "I heard the moment of murder and didn't recognize it. The silence was her death, and I walked away." Miss Marple reached over and patted his hand. "You couldn't have known, Mr. Webb. Dorothy had created a perfectly innocent explanation for everything you observed. Even if you had interrupted, you likely would have accepted her explanation that she was helping Patricia with sudden illness. The truth was too horrible, too carefully disguised for anyone to see without knowing what to look for. But I should have looked, Marcus insisted. I should have been more observant, more suspicious. Instead, I was so focused on my own problems, my own fear of exposure, that I failed to see someone being murdered right in front of me. Lady Bantry offered more tea, which Marcus declined. He sat silently, staring at the pond, perhaps imagining what had occurred here while he stood mere feet away, separated only by decorative plants and his own preoccupation. "There's something else," he said eventually. "After I returned to the ballroom, I saw Dorothy emerge from the conservatory perhaps 2 minutes later. She looked composed, calm. She immediately engaged Sarah Fletcher in conversation about the second-half program. She laughed at something Sarah said. She appeared completely normal, as though she hadn't just committed murder." "Shock can create strange reactions," Dr. Haydock offered. Or perhaps she felt relief that it was done, that years of blackmail were finally ended. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, she had compartmentalized the act so completely that she could function normally despite what she'd done. I've observed that capacity in other cases. The human mind can be remarkably efficient at separating knowledge from emotion when necessary for survival. Marcus stood, clearly eager to leave the conservatory now that he'd unburdened himself. "I've testified to all of this to Inspector Slack. I'll testify at trial if needed. It's the least I can do, though it can't undo my failure to prevent Patricia's death or Dorothy's crime." After he left, Miss Marple, Lady Bantry and Dr. Haydock remained in the conservatory. The afternoon light slanted through the glass ceiling, creating patterns on the water's surface. The koi fish continued their endless swimming, indifferent to human drama. "This space has become a repository of guilt," Lady Bantry observed. "Marcus feels guilty for not preventing the murder. The other blackmail victims feel guilty for wanting Patricia dead. Even I feel guilty for hosting the event that provided the opportunity for murder." "Guilt is often disproportionate to actual responsibility," Miss Marple replied. "Dorothy Mills alone is responsible for Patricia Hammond's death. Yes, others wanted her dead. Yes, circumstances aligned to provide opportunity. But the decision to act, to crush those pills and mix them with champagne, to hold Patricia's head underwater until she drowned, that was Dorothy's choice alone." Dr. Haydock nodded agreement. "The law recognizes this. Motive and opportunity are investigative tools, but they don't constitute guilt. Action does. Dorothy acted, and she will face the consequences of that action." Miss Marple stood, preparing to leave. "The conservatory is just a room, Lady Bantry. Beautiful and peaceful, designed for reflection and enjoyment of nature. What happened here was terrible, but it doesn't taint the space itself. Water will still flow, fish will still swim, plants will still grow. The evil was temporary, human, and specific. The beauty is permanent." As they walked toward the exit, Miss Marple paused one final time to look at the pond. She thought about Patricia Hammond drowning in 18 inches of water, too sedated to save herself, her life ending in a space designed for tranquility. She thought about Dorothy Mills, driven to murder by years of blackmail, and the threat of renewed destruction, now facing decades in prison for that desperate choice. "The conservatory was a silent witness," Miss Marple murmured. "It saw everything, judged nothing, simply existed as the stage for human tragedy. Perhaps that's the best any of us can do. Witness, remember, but not let the darkness corrupt the light that remains." Chapter 8. Dorothy's Defense. The trial of Dorothy Mills for the murder of Patricia Hammond began in late January at the county assizes. The courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by the sensational details of the case: blackmail, secret past, murder at a Christmas charity concert. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly in the gallery, her knitting bag beside her, observing as the machinery of justice ground through its procedures. Dorothy's barrister, a distinguished King's Counsel named Sir Malcolm Hastings, had built her defence around the theory of diminished responsibility. He argued that years of blackmail, the destruction of her career, and the constant psychological pressure of Patricia's demands had impaired Dorothy's mental state, reducing her culpability for the crime. My client, Sir Malcolm said in his opening statement, is not a cold-blooded killer. She is a victim who, after a decade of systematic abuse, reached a breaking point. The law recognizes that extreme circumstances can affect judgment, can drive otherwise law-abiding citizens to acts they would never contemplate under normal conditions. The prosecution, led by stern-faced Mr. Quincy, painted a different picture. This was a carefully planned murder, he argued. The defendant obtained sedatives, crushed them to powder, brought them to the concert concealed in a pillbox. She deliberately sought a role as hostess to provide cover for her actions. She selected her moment carefully, delivered the poisoned champagne, monitored the victim's condition, escorted her to a secluded location, and drowned her. These are not the actions of someone with diminished responsibility. These are the actions of a calculated killer. The trial's first week focused on establishing the facts of the murder. Inspector Slack testified about the investigation, the discovery of the switched pills in Patricia's hotel room, the discrepancy in Dorothy's prescription count. Dr. Haydock explained the sedative's effects, the drowning mechanics, the minimal time it would take for someone face down in 18 inches of water to die. Marcus Webb testified about observing Dorothy deliver the champagne to Patricia, about hearing voices from the conservatory alcove, about the silence that followed. His guilt was palpable as he spoke, his voice breaking when describing how close he'd been to the actual murder without realizing it. Lady Bantry described the conservatory's layout, confirmed that the tiles had been dry when she'd walked through before the murder, testified to Dorothy's volunteer role as hostess. Sarah Fletcher, Thomas Reed, and Harold Price all testified about Patricia's blackmail operation, providing context for Dorothy's motive but careful not to suggest they approved of the murder. Their testimony might be interpreted as supporting. The second week brought Dorothy herself to the stand. She appeared pale and thin, having lost considerable weight during her incarceration. Her hair, once carefully styled, had gone completely grey. She wore a simple dark dress and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Sir Malcolm guided her through her testimony gently, establishing the timeline of her relationship with Patricia Hammond, the affair with the conductor, the blackmail that had followed. "Can you describe how the blackmail affected your daily life?" Sir Malcolm asked. Dorothy's hands twisted in her lap. "I thought about it constantly. Every time I taught a piano lesson, I thought about what I'd lost. Every time I made a payment to Patricia, I felt humiliated all over again. The money was significant, but the psychological burden was worse. Knowing that someone had that power over me, could destroy me again at any moment, it was like living with a sword hanging above my head by a thread. And when she announced her memoir, I felt the floor drop out of my world." Dorothy's voice trembled. "After bleeding me dry for 10 years, after I'd paid everything she demanded, rebuilt my life as best I could, she was going to expose it all anyway. Not for blackmail this time, but for entertainment, for book sales, for her own glory. It felt like the cruelest joke imaginable." Sir Malcolm paused, letting this sink in. "What was your mental state in the weeks leading up to the concert?" "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. I kept imagining what would happen when the book was published. My students leaving, their parents gossiping, the village where I'd finally found some peace turning against me. I felt trapped, desperate, like I was drowning already." "Did you plan to kill Patricia Hammond?" Dorothy was silent for a long moment. "I don't know. I had thoughts, terrible thoughts, but I couldn't tell if they were fantasies or plans. I obtained the sedatives legitimately for my anxiety, but yes, I admit that at some point I began thinking about using them differently. It felt unreal, like something happening to someone else. I couldn't believe I was actually contemplating murder." "What happened at the concert?" "I was functioning on autopilot. I volunteered as hostess because it gave me something to do, a role to play. When I saw Patricia, so confident and beautiful, accepting everyone's congratulations, it made me furious. She'd destroyed so many lives and suffered no consequences. Everyone loved her voice, admired her success, never knowing what she really was." Dorothy's composure began cracking. When she complained about her champagne going flat, something snapped. I had the powder in my pocket. I'd brought it without really planning to use it, but suddenly I knew I would. I went to the service table, added the powder to a fresh glass, stirred it thoroughly, brought it back to her. She thanked me, actually thanked me for poisoning her. And then? I watched her drink it, watched the drugs take effect. When she said she felt strange, I offered to help her to the conservatory. She trusted me completely. Why wouldn't she? I was just a hostess, just someone being helpful. We went to the conservatory together. She was leaning on me, confused, asking what was happening to her. Dorothy's voice dropped to barely audible levels. I told her everything would be fine, that she just needed to splash some water on her face. I helped her bend toward the pond. When she started to fall forward, I didn't stop her. I pushed her head under this water and held it there. She struggled, but the drugs had made her weak. It didn't take long. Tears streamed down her face now. Afterward, I splashed water on the tiles to make it look like an accident. I switched her champagne glass for a clean one. I arranged her dress to look natural. Then I went back to the ballroom and pretended to be shocked when her body was discovered. I thought I'd gotten away with it, but Miss Marple saw through everything. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Mr. Quincy methodically dismantled any suggestion of diminished responsibility, highlighting how each action demonstrated clear planning and rational thought. You obtained the sedatives weeks before the concert, correct? Yes. You volunteered as hostess specifically to have access to champagne service, correct? Yes. You brought the crushed sedatives to the concert concealed in a pillbox, correct? Yes. You waited for an appropriate moment to deliver the drugged champagne, correct? Yes. You monitored Patricia Hammond's condition to determine when the drugs had sufficiently incapacitated her, correct? Yes. You staged the accident scene carefully to deflect suspicion, correct? Yes. These are all actions of someone thinking clearly, planning methodically, acting with deliberate intent. Where is the diminished responsibility, Miss Mills? Dorothy had no answer. Her defense collapsed under the weight of her own carefully executed plans. Sir Malcolm tried to salvage something in redirect examination, emphasizing the psychological pressure Dorothy had endured, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions suggested they saw a murderer, not a victim. Miss Marple watched from the gallery as both sides presented their closing arguments. Sir Malcolm appealed to sympathy, describing Patricia Hammond's blackmail operation as a form of violence that had driven Dorothy to desperate measures. Mr. Quincy appealed to law and order, insisting that understanding motive didn't excuse murder, that society required consistent application of justice regardless of circumstances. The judge's instructions to the jury were clear and fair. They must determine whether Dorothy Mills had murdered Patricia Hammond with malice aforethought. If yes, they must find her guilty of murder. The question of whether her responsibility was diminished due to mental impairment was a separate consideration that might affect sentencing, but not guilt itself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning their verdict, guilty of murder. Dorothy received the verdict with no visible reaction, as though she'd expected nothing else. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for preparation of mitigation arguments. Miss Marple walked home through the winter evening, troubled by what she'd witnessed. Justice had been served in the legal sense. Dorothy had murdered Patricia and would be punished for it. But the moral complexity of the case remained, unresolved. Patricia's systematic destruction of lives through blackmail would never face legal sanction. Her victims would carry their scars forever. And Dorothy, who had finally snapped under years of pressure, would spend decades in prison while Patricia's reputation remained relatively intact, her blackmail operation seen as shameful, but not criminal. The law is a blunt instrument, Miss Marple murmured to herself as she reached her cottage. It addresses actions but not contexts, punishes outcomes but not provocations. Perhaps that's necessary for justice to function, but it leaves so much human suffering unacknowledged. She thought of Dorothy Mills, once a talented accompanist with a bright future, reduced to a convicted murderer by a single terrible decision born of a decade of psychological torture. She thought of the Christmas charity concert, corrupted from celebration into crime scene, and she thought of the conservatory pond, that beautiful space that had become a drowning pool, a symbol of how quickly beauty could transform into horror when human desperation intervened. The case was concluded in legal terms, but its echoes would resonate through St. Mary Mead for years to come, a reminder that beneath the surface of civilized society, darkness always waited for opportunity to emerge. Chapter 9. The Price of Secrets. In the weeks following Dorothy Mill's conviction, St. Mary Mead attempted to return to normalcy. Though the shadow of the murder lingered over every conversation and gathering, Miss Marple found herself the subject of considerable attention as villagers sought her perspective on the case and its implications. One afternoon in mid-February, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Timothy Blackwood, Patricia Hammond's literary executor, arrived bearing a leather satchel filled with papers. He was a slight man in his 30s, with the harried expression of someone dealing with complications he'd never anticipated. "Miss Marple," he began after accepting tea, "I find myself in a most difficult position. Patricia Hammond's will appointed me executor of her literary estate, which includes the memoir she'd been writing. The publisher is demanding the manuscript, citing their contract, but having read it, I'm deeply troubled by its contents." "You're wondering whether to allow its publication," Miss Marple said. "Exactly. The memoir names names, provides explicit details of scandals and blackmail. If published, it will destroy numerous reputations, ruin careers, devastate families. Patricia is dead, Dorothy Mills is in prison, but the harm Patricia intended to cause can still occur if I allow this book into the world." He withdrew the manuscript from his satchel. "I've brought it to you because everyone says you understand human nature better than anyone. I need guidance. What would you do?" Miss Marple accepted the manuscript and spent the next hour reading portions of it. Timothy waited patiently, refilling teacups, and staring out the window at Miss Marple's winter garden. When she finally set the manuscript aside, her expression was deeply troubled. "This is a catalogue of cruelty," she said quietly. "Patricia Hammond took people's mistakes, vulnerabilities, and secrets and weaponized them for profit and entertainment. There's no redemptive purpose here, no social good served by these revelations. It's simply punishment and exposure for their own sake. So, I shouldn't allow publication?" "I cannot make that decision for you, Mr. Blackwood, but I can ask you to consider the consequences. How many lives will this book destroy? How many children will learn terrible things about their parents? How many careers, built painstakingly over years, will collapse overnight? And for what purpose? To honour Patricia Hammond's memory? To satisfy public curiosity about scandal? To enrich a publishing company?" Timothy nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. I've been leaning toward suppressing it, but the publisher is threatening to sue. They claim the contract gives them rights to any manuscript Patricia completed, and she'd delivered 300 pages before her death. Contracts can be disputed, lawsuits can be fought, but published words cannot be unpublished. Once these stories are in the world, the damage is permanent." Miss Marple paused, then added, "There's also the question of whether publishing this memoir dishonours Dorothy Mill's sacrifice." Her sacrifice? Dorothy Mills murdered to prevent this book from being published. She'll spend decades in prison for that choice. If you now allow publication anyway, her crime becomes meaningless, her punishment without purpose. I'm not suggesting her action was justified, but there's a cruel irony in punishing someone for murder committed to prevent harm, then allowing that harm to occur regardless. Timothy sat in thought for several minutes. Finally he said, "I'll fight the publication. I'll dispute the contract, argue that Patricia's death voids their rights, tie it up in courts for years if necessary, whatever it takes to keep this manuscript from reaching the public." After Timothy left, Miss Marple received another visitor, Sarah Fletcher, the young violinist whose father's embezzlement Patricia had documented. Sarah appeared much calmer than during her previous visit, though still carrying the weight of her ordeal. "I wanted to thank you," Sarah said. "Inspector Slack told me you were instrumental in solving the case, in ensuring Dorothy Mills faced justice. I know Dorothy killed Patricia to protect herself, but she also protected all of us. The memoir won't be published now. Our secrets will remain secret." "Mr. Blackwood is attempting to suppress publication," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But even if he succeeds, the secrets themselves remain. They don't disappear simply because Patricia Hammond is dead." Sarah's face fell. "You mean someone else could discover them?" "I mean that secrets have weight, Miss Fletcher. They affect how we live, the choices we make, the relationships we build. Your father's embezzlement is a fact, regardless of who knows about it. Dorothy Mill's affair is a fact. Thomas Reed's plagiarism is a fact. These truths exist independently of whether they're exposed to the world. So what should we do?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I believe secrets lose their power when we stop fearing exposure. Your father embezzled money years ago and died before facing consequences. That's history. It doesn't define you unless you let it. Dorothy destroyed her life trying to keep her affair secret, paying blackmail for a decade, ultimately committing murder. What might have happened if she'd simply accepted exposure years ago? The scandal would have passed. She might have rebuilt her career eventually. Instead, she let the secret control her until it destroyed her completely. You're saying we should confess our secrets voluntarily. I'm saying you should consider whether the burden of keeping secrets is greater than the cost of exposure. Patricia Hammond weaponized secrets, but only because people valued secrecy so highly they'd pay anything to maintain it. If we stopped treating mistakes and human weakness as catastrophic, if we allowed for redemption and forgiveness, blackmail would have no power. Sarah absorbed this thoughtfully. My mother is quite elderly now. Learning about my father's embezzlement would hurt her terribly. I don't think I can tell her. Then that's your choice, Miss Marple said gently, but make it consciously, understanding that you're choosing to carry that burden to protect her, not because Patricia Hammond's ghost still has power over you. There's a difference between kind discretion and fearful secrecy. Over the following weeks, Miss Marple observed how Patricia Hammond's other victims grappled with similar questions. Thomas Reed eventually published a public acknowledgement of his plagiarism, apologizing to the original composer's family and announcing his retirement from composition. The scandal was brief and surprisingly muted. Many in the musical community expressed respect for his honesty and courage in coming forward. Harold Price hired an army of accountants and lawyers to address his company's tax irregularities, paying substantial fines but avoiding criminal prosecution. His business reputation suffered, but survival was possible once the secrets were addressed openly rather than festering in darkness. Marcus Webb gave an interview to a respected arts magazine discussing his experiences as a gay man in the opera world. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, with many younger performers thanking him for his honesty. The career limitations he'd feared from exposure never materialized. Instead, he found himself offered more roles, respected for his authenticity as much as his talent. Dorothy Mills remained in prison, her case becoming a subject of legal and ethical debate. Some argued for reduced sentences in blackmail-related crimes, recognizing the provocation victims endured. Others insisted that murder could never be excused regardless of circumstances. Dorothy herself gave only one interview, to a prison reform advocate, in which she expressed profound regret for taking Patricia's life. I let fear control me, Dorothy said in that interview. I was so terrified of exposure, of judgment, of losing what little I'd rebuilt, that I convinced myself murder was the only solution. But Miss Marple was right. The secret had already destroyed my life. I'd paid over £25,000, lived in constant anxiety, sacrificed any chance at peace or happiness. Even if Patricia's memoir had been published, it couldn't have hurt me worse than I'd already hurt myself. The interview circulated widely, becoming part of ongoing discussions about blackmail, victim psychology, and the desperation that drives ordinary people to extraordinary crimes. Dorothy's case was cited in legal journals, ethics courses, and criminology studies. She became, against her will, a symbol of how fear can corrupt judgment, how secrets can poison lives, and how the desire to protect oneself from exposure can lead to far worse consequences than exposure itself. Miss Marple followed these developments with interest, reflecting on how a single Christmas charity concert had rippled outward to affect so many lives, raise so many questions, challenge so many assumptions about justice, secrecy, and human nature. One spring afternoon, she received a visit from Inspector Slack, who had news about the final disposition of Patricia Hammond's estate. The memoir had been successfully suppressed, with the publisher settling out of court after damaging revelations about their willingness to profit from blackmail victims' suffering. Patricia's substantial wealth, accumulated through years of extortion, was being distributed to various charities, with none going to her few distant relatives. Seemed fitting, Inspector Slack said. Money gained through blackmail going to legitimate charity. Patricia corrupted one charity concert with her presence and her murder, but her money will fund genuine charitable work for years to come. A form of redemption, Miss Marple observed, though not one Patricia would have chosen. Do you think she ever regretted what she did? The inspector asked. The blackmail, the destroyed careers, the lives she ruined. Miss Marple considered the question. I doubt it. People like Patricia Hammond typically justify their actions to themselves. She probably believed she was simply capitalizing on information, that her victim's vulnerability was their own fault. Blackmailers rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as opportunists, as people clever enough to profit from others' mistakes, while their victims see them as monsters. Yes, and sometimes victims become monsters themselves, as Dorothy did. That's the true cost of blackmail. Not just the money extracted, but the corruption of character it produces in everyone involved. Patricia corrupted herself through greed and cruelty. She corrupted her victims through fear and desperation, and she corrupted Dorothy so thoroughly that murder seemed like a reasonable solution. Inspector Slack prepared to leave, then paused. You know, Miss Marple, this case has made me think differently about secrets. My wife has been after me for years to be more open about my feelings, my worries, my mistakes. I always thought that keeping things to myself was stronger, more private. But watching how secrets destroyed everyone in this case, I'm reconsidering. Maybe there's strength in honesty, in not having anything to hide. I believe so, Miss Marple agreed. Though discretion has its place, as does privacy, the key is distinguishing between healthy privacy and fearful secrecy. One protects dignity, the other enables manipulation. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the spring sunshine and the sight of early crocuses pushing through the soil. She thought about the conservatory pond at Gossington Hall, where Patricia Hammond had drowned, where beauty had been corrupted by violence. Lady Bantry had written to say she was keeping the pond but adding safety features, better lighting, and more open sightlines. The space would remain beautiful but less isolated, less conducive to hidden actions. That seemed appropriate, Miss Marple reflected. Beauty need not be diminished by tragedy, but it could be made safer, more open, less vulnerable to corruption. The same principle applied to human relationships, to communities, to the social structures that governed behavior. Openness, honesty, and compassion created environments where blackmail had no power, where secrets lost their sting, where desperation need not lead to violence. The Christmas charity concert had been meant to celebrate community, art, and generosity. Instead, it had become the stage for murder, the culmination of years of blackmail and fear. But perhaps some good could emerge from the tragedy. People were talking more honestly about secrets, about the price of privacy, about how fear could corrupt and destroy. If that conversation led to greater openness, more compassion, better support for those being exploited, then perhaps Patricia Hammond's death and Dorothy Mill's imprisonment would produce some small redemptive value. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles moving in their familiar rhythm. Life continued. Patterns emerged, threads tangled and untangled. The work of understanding human nature was never finished, but each case, each tragedy, each glimpse into human motivation added to the accumulated wisdom that guided her observations. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did. The conservatory pond would remain beautiful, and somewhere Dorothy Mills would serve her sentence, living with the consequences of one terrible decision made in desperation, a reminder that the price of secrets was sometimes higher than anyone could afford to pay. Chapter 10. Reflections on a Winter's Crime. 6 months after Dorothy Mill's conviction, Miss Marple sat in her cottage on a warm summer evening, working on a complicated knitting pattern while reflecting on the case that had disrupted St. Mary Mead's Christmas season. Her nephew Raymond had come to visit, curious about the conclusion of various threads the murder had left dangling. "I've been reading about the case in the legal journals," Raymond said, settling into the armchair across from his aunt. "It's become quite famous as an example of blackmail-driven crime. Dorothy Mills's defense has spawned considerable academic debate about victim culpability and psychological duress." "Yes, I've seen some of the articles," Miss Marple replied, "though I find the academic discussions sometimes miss the human reality of what occurred. It's easy to debate theories when one hasn't seen Dorothy's face as she confessed, or heard the desperation in the voices of Patricia's other victims. Do you think justice was served? Dorothy received life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 15 years. Some argue that's too harsh given the provocation. Others say it's too lenient for premeditated murder." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Justice is a complicated concept, Raymond. In legal terms, Dorothy murdered Patricia and must face consequences. That's straightforward. But in moral terms, Patricia spent years destroying lives through blackmail, causing immeasurable harm that society never punished because blackmail, while morally reprehensible, can be difficult to prosecute. Two wrongs don't make a right, but pretending the first wrong didn't exist seems equally unjust. So, you think Dorothy was justified? No, I think she was desperate. There's a difference. Justification implies the action was right. Desperation means she felt she had no other choice, but she was wrong about that. She could have exposed Patricia's blackmail operation, could have gone to the police, could have simply accepted the exposure and dealt with the consequences. Instead, she chose murder, and that choice cannot be excused. Raymond nodded thoughtfully. What about the other victims? How are they managing? Remarkably well, considering. Sarah Fletcher has been performing more publicly, and her mother passed away peacefully last month, never learning about her husband's embezzlement. Sarah tells me she feels both relief and guilt about that. Thomas Reed's confession has actually enhanced his reputation in some circles, seen as an act of courage and honesty. Harold Price paid his fines and has restructured his business to be fully compliant with tax law. And Marcus Webb is thriving, with his openness about his sexuality making him something of a role model for younger performers. So, their secrets lost power once they stopped fearing exposure. Exactly. That's the lesson Patricia Hammond never learned and Dorothy Mills learned too late. Secrets have only the power we give them through fear. Once we accept that mistakes and human weakness are universal, that judgment is temporary but integrity is permanent, the blackmailer's weapon becomes ineffective. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Miss Marple's needles clicking steadily. Outside, the summer evening was warm and peaceful, birds singing in the garden, neighbours passing on their evening walks. St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual rhythms, though the memory of Christmas's tragedy remained. "I visited Gossington Hall last week," Raymond said eventually. "Lady Bantry invited me to see the renovated conservatory. The pond is still there, but everything else has been rearranged. More open, better lit, less isolated. She's turned it into a memorial garden dedicated to charity work, specifically supporting organisations that help victims of extortion and blackmail." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said approvingly. "Transforming the site of tragedy into something that addresses the underlying causes. That's redemption of a meaningful sort. She asked me to tell you that the koi fish are thriving. She found it somehow important that you know they survived, that the pond's beauty persists despite what occurred there." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Life continues, Raymond. That's perhaps the most important lesson of all. Dorothy Mills committed murder in the conservatory, and the legal system has addressed that crime. But the fish still swim, the water still flows, the plants still grow. Beauty persists despite human darkness. That's both comforting and humbling." "Will you attend Dorothy's parole hearing? It's 15 years away, but apparently she's already indicated she'd like you to testify on her behalf." "If I'm still alive in 15 years, I'll consider it. Dorothy deserves a chance at redemption, at rebuilding some kind of life after prison. But that decision belongs to the parole board, not to me. I can only testify to what I observed. A desperate woman driven to terrible action by years of psychological torture, who showed genuine remorse and understanding of her crime's severity." Raymond stood, preparing to leave for dinner at the vicarage. "You know, Aunt Jane, what strikes me most about this case is how it turned Christmas upside down. The season of peace and goodwill became the backdrop for murder. The charity concert meant to raise money for good causes instead became a crime scene. It seems almost sacrilegious." "Christmas doesn't prevent human darkness, Raymond. It merely highlights the contrast. The decorations, the music, the charitable purpose, all of that made Patricia's blackmail and Dorothy's murder seem even more shocking. But humans remain human regardless of season. We carry our secrets, our fears, our desperation into every setting, festive or otherwise." After Raymond left, Miss Marple sat alone, with her knitting, watching twilight deepen over her garden. She thought about the Christmas charity concert, about how an event meant to celebrate community had instead exposed the fractures and fears that lurked beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface. She thought about Patricia Hammond, whose extraordinary vocal talent had been corrupted by greed and cruelty, who had used her position in the opera world to accumulate secrets and extract money, who had died face down in 18 inches of water, murdered by one of her many victims. She thought about Dorothy Mills, once a promising accompanist, whose affair with a married man had been weaponized by Patricia into decades of blackmail, who had paid over £25,000 for silence, who had finally snapped and committed murder rather than face renewed exposure. She thought about the conservatory pond, that beautiful space designed for tranquility, which had become a drowning pool through human desperation, which was now being transformed into a memorial garden supporting blackmail victims. And she thought about justice, that complicated concept that the legal system tried to codify, but which remained stubbornly resistant to simple definition. Dorothy would serve 15 years minimum for murder. Patricia's victims would carry their scars forever. The law had done what it could, but the deeper questions about responsibility, provocation, and redemption remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. The pattern she was working on was called Winter's Tale, an intricate design of snowflakes and evergreen branches, appropriate for the Christmas stockings she was preparing for next year's church bazaar. The pattern required careful attention. One dropped stitch could distort the entire design. Rather like life, she reflected. Each action, each decision, each moment of weakness or strength contributed to the larger pattern. Dorothy's decision to murder Patricia had seemed isolated, desperate, almost inevitable in the moment. But it was actually the culmination of thousands of smaller decisions: to engage in the affair, to pay the blackmail rather than confess, to let fear control her choices, to see murder as solution rather than accepting exposure and rebuilding. Similarly, Patricia's death at that particular charity concert wasn't random. It was the logical endpoint of years of cruelty, of accumulating victims, of pushing desperate people to their breaking points. Patricia had created the circumstances of her own murder through systematic exploitation of human weakness and fear. The Christmas charity concert had merely provided the stage. The conservatory pond had merely provided the means. But the true causes of Patricia Hammond's death lay in character flaws and moral failures that had been developing for decades, in both victim and killer. As darkness fell completely, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and moved to close the curtains. Outside, St. Mary Mead was peaceful, lights glowing in cottage windows, the church spire silhouetted against the darkening sky. A village seemingly unchanged by the winter's tragedy, yet subtly different in ways only the observant would notice. People spoke more carefully about secrets now, more aware of the power that information could wield. The charity concert would be held again next Christmas, but at a different venue with different organisers, deliberately distancing itself from the tragedy at Gossington Hall. And those who had been touched by the case carried new understanding about fear, desperation, and the terrible prices people paid for keeping secrets. Miss Marple had solved the mystery, identified the killer, ensured justice was served. But the deeper mystery, why humans insisted on destroying themselves and others through fear and secrecy, remained as inscrutable as ever. That mystery, she suspected, would never be fully solved. It was simply the nature of humanity, the flaw in the pattern that made each person's story unique and unpredictable. As she settled into bed that night, Miss Marple offered a brief prayer for Dorothy Mills, serving her sentence in prison, and for Patricia Hammond, whose talent and cruelty had ended in a shallow pond on a Christmas evening. She prayed for the victims who had survived, for the community that had been shaken, and for herself, that she might continue to see clearly the patterns of human behaviour while maintaining compassion for the flawed creatures who created those patterns. The Christmas charity concert drowning would remain in St. Mary Mead's collective memory as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even festive occasions could harbour darkness, that secrets carried terrible costs and that desperation could drive good people to evil acts. But it would also eventually fade, as all such events did, into the background of village history, referenced occasionally but no longer immediate, no longer raw. Life would continue. Mysteries would arise. Miss Marple would observe, deduce, and occasionally intervene when justice required it. Her knitting needles would click steadily through patterns simple and complex. And somewhere in the rhythm of daily life, in the accumulation of small observations and quiet insights, understanding would deepen, wisdom would grow, and the tangled threads of human nature would continue to reveal themselves to those patient enough to look carefully. The Yuletide drowning was over, its lessons remained, and Miss Marple, faithful witness to human folly and resilience, would carry those lessons forward into whatever mysteries St. Mary Mead chose to present next. The end. Thank you for joining us on Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, and I hope you enjoyed this journey through Miss Marple's investigation of the Christmas charity concert Drowning. If this story resonated with you, please consider leaving a comment about where you're listening from and share your thoughts on the case. Until next time, may your own mysteries be solved with wisdom and compassion. Farewell from St. Mary Mead.